The Battle of Orsha in 1941 took place within the larger framework of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union launched on 22nd June. The city of Orsha, situated on the Dnieper River in eastern Belarus, held significant strategic value. It was a major railway junction, linking Moscow with Minsk and Smolensk, and its position on the Dnieper line gave it both defensive and logistical importance. The battle that unfolded there in July 1941 became one of the most destructive clashes of armor in the opening months of the campaign, earning a reputation as an armored graveyard due to the sheer scale of tank losses on both sides. The geopolitical background that led to this confrontation was rooted in the broader German-Soviet conflict of the early Second World War. Following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, the Soviet Union had occupied eastern Poland and incorporated the Baltic states, while Germany had secured western Poland and consolidated its dominance in Western Europe. By 1941, however, Hitler had resolved to destroy the Soviet Union, both for ideological reasons and for control of resources and territory. Operation Barbarossa aimed to annihilate the Red Army in the border zones and capture Leningrad, Moscow, and the Ukraine within months. For the Soviet Union, intelligence warnings of an impending attack were ignored or underestimated. Soviet leadership was caught between rearmament programs still underway and the rigid doctrine that dictated no retreat from the western border. Orsha's significance emerged from both geography and infrastructure. The Dnieper River formed part of the Soviet defensive line in the western USSR. Orsha was a key crossing point, with railways running east-west and north-south, making it a vital hub for troop movements and supplies. Whoever controlled Orsha would influence the flow of reinforcements toward Moscow and the ability to shift units along the front. For the Germans, seizing Orsha meant securing a direct path toward Moscow through Smolensk, bypassing secondary routes that lacked the same logistical value. For the Soviets, holding Orsha meant denying the enemy control of vital transport corridors and buying time to reinforce the approaches to Moscow. The military preparedness of both sides at the outbreak of Barbarossa shaped the context of the coming battle. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was the most powerful of the German army groups, with 2 panzer groups and 2 field armies. Its spearhead divisions had already advanced hundreds of kilometers in the first weeks, destroying multiple Soviet formations in large encirclements. By mid-July, German forces approached the Dnieper, where Soviet defenses had hastily reorganized after the catastrophic defeats near Minsk. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group pressed toward Smolensk, and Orsha became one of the focal points of this advance. On the Soviet side, the Red Army had already lost vast numbers of men and equipment. By 10 July, Soviet losses across the front were estimated at over 750,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, and thousands of tanks destroyed. The Western Front, commanded by General Dmitry Pavlov until his dismissal and execution in early July, had been virtually destroyed in the battles west of Minsk. General Semyon Timoshenko took over, attempting to stabilize the front along the Dnieper. At Orsha, the defense was led by remnants of mechanized corps, rifle divisions, and newly mobilized reserves. Despite the devastation, the Soviets still possessed large numbers of tanks on paper, including modern T-34s and KV-1s, but most were scattered, mechanically unreliable, or lacked fuel and ammunition. Many units were commanded by inexperienced officers thrust into battle with little preparation. Public sentiment in the Soviet Union at this stage reflected shock and disorientation. The population of Belarus had already endured weeks of retreat, bombardment, and occupation. Civilians in Orsha faced the imminent arrival of German forces, with evacuation efforts underway but disorganized. Factories and rail depots were stripped of equipment where possible and moved eastward, but much was abandoned. Local Communist Party officials attempted to organize militia battalions, using workers and students armed with rifles, or even improvised weapons. Propaganda broadcasts called for determination, insisting that the Dnieper would be the line where the invader would be stopped. German intelligence assessments underestimated Soviet resilience. The Wehrmacht believed that Soviet forces had been shattered in the opening battles and that organized resistance east of the Dnieper would be limited. Planners assumed that Orsha could be taken quickly and used as a springboard for the advance on Smolensk. In reality, the Soviet High Command was throwing every available reserve into the line, including mechanized corps with hundreds of tanks. Although many of these vehicles would break down or be lost to air attacks before reaching the battlefield, the concentration of armor around Orsha in July produced one of the largest tank clashes of 1941. By mid-July, the stage was set. German panzer divisions approached from the west, supported by motorized infantry and artillery. Soviet mechanized corps converged from multiple directions, intent on holding Orsha at all costs. Both sides recognized the importance of the railway junction and the Dnieper crossings. The battle that followed would destroy thousands of tanks, disrupt both armies' plans, and leave Orsha marked as one of the most violent armored confrontations of the summer campaign. The context of Barbarossa, the geographical importance of the Dnieper, and the desperate state of Soviet defenses all combined to make Orsha a decisive battlefield in the struggle for the approaches to Moscow. The opening phase of the Battle of Orsha began in the first days of July 1941 as German armored spearheads of Army Group Center advanced rapidly through Belarus after the collapse of Soviet defenses around Minsk. The encirclement battles west of the Berezina River had destroyed much of the Soviet Western Front, leaving only fragmented formations capable of delaying actions. German forces, moving with speed and precision, sought to seize the crossings of the Dnieper before the Soviets could regroup. Orsha, located at the confluence of key roads and railways, became a natural objective. For the Wehrmacht, it promised a gateway to Smolensk and eventually Moscow. For the Red Army, it represented a last chance to halt, or at least delay the advance. The German units pressing toward Orsha were among the most experienced of the campaign. General Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group advanced from the north, while General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group pushed from the south. Both had already achieved spectacular successes during the first weeks of Barbarossa, encircling Soviet armies and capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. Their panzer divisions, equipped with Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, supported by motorized infantry and artillery, were accompanied by the Luftwaffe, which maintained air superiority. The operational plan was simple but ambitious: break through toward the Dnieper, capture Orsha before the Soviets could mount a coherent defense, and exploit eastward toward Smolensk. The Soviet response to this threat was shaped by desperation. After the destruction of much of the Western Front, command was reorganized under Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, who attempted to stabilize the line along the Dnieper. Reinforcements were rushed in from the interior, including the 20th Army under General Pavel Kurochkin, which deployed near Orsha. Soviet mechanized corps, despite being badly depleted in earlier battles, were committed once again. These included the 5th and 7th Mechanized Corps, fielding hundreds of tanks on paper, though in practice many were unserviceable. Among them were modern T-34s and KV-1s, tanks that German forces had only begun to encounter and which proved resistant to most standard anti-tank weapons. However, shortages of fuel, ammunition, and trained crews undermined their effectiveness. Commanders had little time to organize coordinated operations, and many units were thrown into battle piecemeal. In the first week of July, German advance guards reached the outskirts of Orsha. Reconnaissance units clashed with Soviet forward detachments, testing defenses and probing for weak points. Luftwaffe raids intensified, targeting rail stations, bridges, and supply depots. Columns of refugees fleeing eastward were bombed, adding to the chaos on the roads. Soviet forces attempted to organize defensive belts west of the city, digging trenches and fortifying villages. Worker battalions and local militias joined the army units, creating improvised defenses. Yet the speed of the German advance meant that many preparations were incomplete when the main assaults began. The command structures on both sides reflected the tension of this opening phase. German divisional commanders emphasized rapid exploitation, urging their troops to bypass strong points and drive deep into the Soviet rear. Coordination between tanks, infantry, and artillery allowed for flexible maneuver. Soviet commanders, by contrast, struggled to impose order on a chaotic situation. Communications were unreliable, with radio networks disrupted by bombing and many headquarters destroyed in earlier battles. Orders were often delayed or contradictory, reflecting the confusion at higher levels of command. Stalin's directives to hold ground at all costs clashed with the reality of units unable to withstand concentrated German attacks. On 6th to 8th July, the first serious clashes occurred west of Orsha. German panzer divisions attempted to force crossings of the Dnieper's tributaries, while Soviet mechanized corps counterattacked to push them back. Battles around small towns and river fords became intense, with tanks engaging at close range and infantry fighting for every bridge. German reports noted the unexpected toughness of Soviet resistance, particularly the appearance of T-34s and KV-1s, which withstood direct hits from standard German anti-tank guns. Improvised measures, such as the use of 80mm anti-aircraft guns in a ground roll, were required to stop them. Soviet counterattacks, though often uncoordinated, inflicted losses on German spearheads and temporarily slowed their advance. Despite these efforts, the German advance continued. Superior air support and logistics gave the Wehrmacht the advantage in sustaining momentum. Luftwaffe bombers struck Soviet tank columns on the march, destroying many vehicles before they reached the battlefield. Fuel shortages forced Soviet crews to abandon tanks, which were then destroyed to prevent capture. Infantry units, poorly supported by armor or artillery, were overwhelmed by concentrated German assaults. Villages along the approaches to Orsha changed hands multiple times, leaving behind burned houses and heavy casualties. Civilians caught in the fighting suffered greatly, with many killed in bombardments or forced to flee into the forests. By the second week of July, the opening phase of the battle had established its essential dynamics. The Germans had reached the Dnieper near Orsha and were pressing for a breakthrough, while the Soviets were throwing in all available reserves to hold the line. Both sides recognized the stakes. For the Wehrmacht, Orsha was a step on the road to Smolensk and ultimately Moscow. For the Red Army, it was a line that had to be defended at any cost to buy time for the capital. The stage was set for one of the most destructive armored battles of the summer, as the Dnieper line became the site of repeated attacks and counterattacks in the weeks that followed. The strategic significance of Orsha in July 1941 was clear to both German and Soviet commands. It was not simply a regional center, but a decisive point along the Dnieper line, a river barrier the Soviets hoped could slow or halt the German advance. Orsha's railway hub and road network made it indispensable for reinforcement and supply. Whoever controlled it would dictate the tempo of operations in central Belarus and shape the subsequent drive toward Smolensk and Moscow. As the Wehrmacht and Red Army prepared for the coming clash, their objectives, doctrines, and logistical realities set the stage for a confrontation of extraordinary scale. For the Wehrmacht, the objectives were defined by the operational plan of Army Group Center. After the encirclement victories at Minsk, the next step was to drive rapidly eastward to Smolensk, then continue toward Moscow. Orsha, lying on the direct Minsk-Smolensk-Moscow rail line and on the Moscow highway, was a natural objective. German High Command expected the city to fall quickly, allowing panzer divisions to press further east without delay. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group were to converge east of the Dnieper, securing crossings and enveloping Soviet forces retreating from the west. Orsha thus became a pivot point for a double envelopment. Capturing the junction would trap Soviet units defending Smolensk while keeping open the route toward the Soviet capital. German doctrine emphasized speed, maneuver, and concentrated armored thrusts. The planning for Orsha reflected this. Infantry divisions were tasked with fixing Soviet defenders along the river, while panzer units conducted deep penetrations. Engineers were prepared to build pontoon bridges to overcome Soviet demolitions. Logistics were calculated to sustain rapid advances. Fuel and ammunition were pushed forward by truck convoys and rail lines converted to German gauge. Luftwaffe support was integral, with bombers assigned to paralyze Soviet reinforcements by striking rail junctions east of Orsha. German commanders, buoyed by earlier victories, believed that Soviet defenses would crumble once again under pressure. However, they underestimated the ability of Soviet command to concentrate mechanized reserves for a determined stand. On the Soviet side, the objectives were starkly different. The Red Army sought to stabilize the front, protect the road to Moscow, and inflict maximum attrition on German armored units. Orsha was identified as one of the strongest points of the Dnieper line. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, newly appointed commander of the Western Front, ordered the 20th Army under General Pavel Kurochkin to hold the line with rifle divisions, reinforced by remnants of mechanized corps. Soviet High Command understood that further retreats would open the way directly to Smolensk, and possibly beyond, before adequate reinforcements from the interior could arrive. The defense of Orsha was therefore not only tactical, but strategic. It was a delaying operation intended to gain time for the mobilization of new armies being raised deeper in the USSR. Soviet doctrine in 1941 still bore the imprint of pre-war offensive concepts, which envisioned deep armored thrusts supported by mechanized corps. These formations had suffered devastating losses in June, but the Stavka continued to commit them to counterattacks. At Orsha, this meant that the 5th and 7th Mechanized Corps were ordered to strike German panzer divisions approaching the city. Together, they fielded several hundred tanks, including a number of T-34s and KV-1s. In theory, this gave the Soviets a significant armored strength advantage. In practice, poor coordination, lack of radio equipment, shortages of fuel and ammunition, and inexperienced crews reduced their effectiveness. Many Soviet tanks broke down on the march or were lost to air attacks before reaching the battlefield. Still, the concentration of armor in the Orsha sector created the conditions for one of the largest tank clashes of the summer. Logistics posed severe challenges to both sides. For the Germans, the rapid advance across hundreds of kilometers strained supply lines. Fuel shortages were already apparent, forcing panzer units to slow their pace or await convoys. Roads in Belarus were poor, rail conversion took time, and Soviet demolitions destroyed bridges. For the Soviets, logistics were even more dire. The loss of Minsk and other depots meant that supply had to come from the east by overstretched rail lines. Tank units often reached the battlefield with only a fraction of their authorized fuel or ammunition. Artillery units lacked sufficient shells, and infantry divisions often had only a few days' worth of rations. The imbalance in logistical preparation strongly favored the Germans, but the sheer number of Soviet forces thrown into the Orsha sector compensated to some extent. Propaganda and morale played crucial roles in the planning. German propaganda emphasized the invincibility of the Wehrmacht and the inevitability of Soviet defeat, presenting Orsha as another step toward Moscow. Soldiers were told that victory would be swift. On the Soviet side, propaganda emphasized heroic defense and the destruction of the enemy. Political officers urged soldiers to stand firm, invoking the defense of the motherland. Retreat without orders was punishable by execution. Civilians were mobilized to dig trenches, erect barricades, and assist the army. The ideological dimension of the war was clear. For the Germans, Orsha was part of a campaign to destroy Bolshevism. For the Soviets, it was a struggle for survival. Miscalculations shaped both plans. German commanders underestimated Soviet resilience and the number of tanks that could be concentrated at Orsha. They believed the Red Army had been destroyed west of the Dnieper, and that any remaining resistance would be minor. This complacency meant that German panzer units advanced expecting a swift breakthrough, only to face unexpectedly heavy armored counterattacks. On the Soviet side, miscalculations included the belief that large-scale counterattacks by mechanized corps could still be effective despite earlier failures. The commitment of tanks and uncoordinated thrusts exposed them to German air superiority and anti-tank defenses. The expectation that Orsha could be held indefinitely was unrealistic, given the scale of German pressure and Soviet logistical collapse. Nevertheless, the Soviet decision to fight at Orsha delayed the German timetable and inflicted significant material losses. The strategic goals of the battle thus set the parameters for what followed. For the Wehrmacht, Orsha was to be a swift capture, clearing the path to Smolensk. For the Red Army, it was to be a strong point of resistance, buying time for Moscow's defenses. The clash of these objectives ensured that Orsha would not fall without a fight. Instead, it became the site of a massive armored confrontation, where both sides suffered devastating losses. The planning and objectives, shaped by ideology, logistics, and miscalculations, led inexorably toward the battles that would earn Orsha its reputation as the armored graveyard of the Dnieper line. The first major engagements around Orsha began in the second week of July 1941, as German spearheads of Army Group Center advanced eastward, following their victories at Minsk and across the Berezina. The German command expected the Red Army to be in complete disarray, with only scattered resistance remaining along the Dnieper. Instead, they encountered a concentration of Soviet armor and infantry that transformed the Orsha sector into one of the most violent battlefields of the opening campaign. German reconnaissance units were the first to make contact. Armored cars and light tanks probed toward the Dnieper crossings, encountering Soviet forward detachments entrenched in villages and along tributaries of the river. On 8 and 9 July, firefights erupted west of Orsha as Soviet rifle battalions attempted to delay the advance. German infantry, supported by artillery and Stuka dive bombers, cleared these positions, but the resistance indicated that the Soviets were determined to contest the area. Luftwaffe sorties targeted Soviet troop movements on roads and railways, bombing reinforcements moving up from the rear. Columns of Soviet tanks, often exposed in open terrain, became frequent targets for airstrikes that destroyed dozens before they could deploy into battle formations. The main clash began when elements of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group attempted to force crossings near Orsha. Engineers brought forward pontoons and assault boats, constructing temporary bridges under fire. Soviet artillery and machine gun nests contested every attempt, inflicting casualties and destroying equipment. On several occasions, Soviet counterattacks drove German units back from the riverbank. These counterattacks were often led by tanks from the 5th and 7th Mechanized Corps, which had been ordered to hold Orsha at all costs. T-34s and KV-1s, appearing in significant numbers, shocked German units. Standard 37mm anti-tank guns proved ineffective against their armor, forcing the Germans to deploy 80mm anti-aircraft guns in a direct fire role. Even then, destroying these tanks required precise coordination and concentrated fire. The fighting intensified around key villages west of the city. One of the fiercest engagements occurred near Kokonovo, where Soviet tank brigades launched a series of assaults against German bridgeheads. Hundreds of tanks were committed on both sides, creating chaotic battles of close-range fire and maneuver. German Panzer III and IV tanks, supported by motorized infantry, attempted to hold their positions. Soviet crews, often inexperienced, attacked aggressively but with limited coordination. Many tanks advanced without infantry support, making them vulnerable to German anti-tank teams. Airstrikes by the Luftwaffe repeatedly shattered Soviet formations, yet the weight of Soviet armor inflicted heavy losses on German units. German reports noted the destruction of dozens of their own tanks, while Soviet records later acknowledged catastrophic losses, with entire brigades reduced to a fraction of their initial strength. Civilian populations around Orsha were caught directly in the fighting. Villages were bombed and burned as both sides struggled for control. Civilians fled eastward in large numbers, though many were trapped in the battle zone. Evacuation trains were targeted by air raids, causing mass casualties. Within Orsha itself, residents experienced daily bombardments. Buildings were converted into defensive strongpoints, and civilians were drafted to dig trenches and carry supplies. The proximity of the front turned the city into a garrison under siege conditions, even before German forces had reached its outskirts. Morale fluctuated sharply. German troops, accustomed to rapid victories in the first weeks of Barbarossa, were surprised by the intensity of Soviet counterattacks and the resilience of their tanks. Reports described frustration at the inability to destroy T-34s with standard weapons. Soviet soldiers, though suffering extreme losses, gained confidence from the effectiveness of their armor in direct combat. Yet logistical problems, lack of fuel, ammunition shortages, and mechanical breakdowns undermined their efforts. Entire tank battalions were forced to abandon vehicles after running out of fuel, leaving them to be destroyed by German artillery or airstrikes. Unexpected outcomes shaped the first engagements. Instead of collapsing quickly, Soviet forces at Orsha inflicted delays and losses on German units. Panzer divisions that had advanced hundreds of kilometers in the first weeks now found themselves locked in grinding battles. The Soviets, though poorly coordinated, managed to mount repeated counterattacks that slowed the German timetable. However, the cost was staggering. Hundreds of tanks lost, thousands of men killed or captured, and entire divisions reduced to fragments. By mid-July, the area west of Orsha had become a literal armored graveyard, with destroyed tanks from both armies littering the fields. The first clashes thus established the pattern of the battle. German forces continued to push relentlessly toward the city, using superior coordination, air power, and logistics to overcome Soviet defenses. The Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, maintained a determined stand, buying precious time and forcing the Germans to fight for every crossing and road. Orsha had become a focal point of resistance, and what was expected to be a swift advance turned into a protracted struggle that consumed men and machines on an unprecedented scale. As July 1941 progressed, the fighting around Orsha entered a new phase of escalation and crisis for both armies. What had begun as a series of engagements west of the Dnieper now evolved into sustained operations involving multiple divisions, with reinforcement cycles, mounting casualties, and growing strain on logistics and morale. The battlefields around Orsha became scenes of near-constant combat, with villages, bridges, and crossroads changing hands repeatedly. The escalation began when German High Command ordered fresh infantry divisions to close the ring around Orsha, freeing the panzer groups to resume their eastward drive. Infantry of the Ninth Army moved in to hold the line and press the attack against Soviet rifle divisions, while Guderian's and Hoth's armored units continued to probe for breakthroughs. This shift meant that German assaults increased in intensity, with combined arms coordination bringing artillery barrages, air support, and armor into synchronized strikes. Every Soviet position was subjected to preparatory bombardments before being stormed by infantry and tanks. The effect was devastating, particularly on rifle divisions already weakened by earlier losses. Soviet command responded by throwing in more reserves. The 20th Army reinforced its lines with additional rifle divisions and remnants of mechanized corps that had survived earlier encirclements. However, coordination remained poor. Counterattacks were launched in haste, sometimes without artillery preparation or reconnaissance. The result was predictable. Soviet tank columns were often ambushed or destroyed by German airstrikes before reaching the battlefield. Yet the sheer persistence of these efforts kept German units engaged. For the Germans, this meant their timetable toward Smolensk was disrupted, forcing them into attritional battles they had hoped to avoid. Casualties mounted rapidly. German reports indicate that in the Orsha sector alone, dozens of tanks were lost in July, with hundreds of men killed or wounded in daily fighting. Soviet losses were even heavier. Entire brigades reported losing 60–70% of their tanks in a single engagement. Rifle divisions suffered similar attrition, with many reduced to a few hundred effectives. The battlefield became littered with destroyed equipment, leading both armies to refer to the area as a graveyard of tanks and vehicles. Recovery units worked day and night, salvaging usable parts or towing away damaged vehicles, but the pace of destruction outstripped repair capacity. Terrain and weather added to the crisis. The region around Orsha consisted of forests, rivers, and marshes that limited maneuverability. German armored columns found their movements constrained to narrow roads and bridges, which became choke points vulnerable to Soviet artillery. Soviet forces, meanwhile, struggled with the same terrain when launching counterattacks, often losing tanks to mechanical breakdowns in the soft ground. Summer heat created dust clouds that revealed troop movements to enemy aircraft. Water shortages affected soldiers in forward positions, while disease spread in overcrowded medical stations overwhelmed by casualties. Morale reflected the strain of escalation. German soldiers, though still confident in their eventual success, began to question the expectation of a rapid victory. Encounters with T-34s and KV-1s, which could withstand multiple hits, were unsettling. Luftwaffe air superiority reassured them, but losses in prolonged engagements dampened the sense of invincibility. Soviet morale was mixed. Political officers urged troops to hold, invoking patriotism and harsh discipline, including summary executions for desertion. Despite this, some units disintegrated under pressure. Others, however, fought with remarkable determination, inspired by the visible effectiveness of their newer tanks in close combat and by propaganda framing Orsha as a decisive stand for the defense of Moscow. At the international level, the escalation of fighting on the Eastern Front, including battles like Orsha, attracted attention. German reports broadcast victories, presenting the destruction of Soviet armies as evidence of Barbarossa's success. In Britain, however, the scale of Soviet resistance surprised observers, raising hopes that Germany would become bogged down in the East. Within the Soviet Union, radio broadcasts highlighted the heroism of Orsha's defenders, portraying the battle as a symbol of resilience against overwhelming odds. These competing narratives underscored the political significance of the struggle, even as soldiers on the ground endured relentless combat. By late July, both armies faced a crisis of sustainability. German units were increasingly tied down in costly operations, their advance slowed, while the Soviets were burning through reserves at an unsustainable rate. The area around Orsha had become one of the most intense sectors of the front, with no clear resolution in sight. The battle had escalated into a grinding confrontation of men and machines, leaving both sides exhausted and the Dnieper line marked by devastation. The fighting around Orsha reached its peak in the last 10 days of July 1941, when both German and Soviet commands concentrated their maximum available strength in the sector. What had begun as mobile thrusts and counter-thrusts now hardened into large-scale clashes of armor and infantry, with the city and its surrounding terrain turned into one of the most violent killing grounds of the summer campaign. The Wehrmacht sought to break through definitively and open the route to Smolensk, while the Red Army continued to throw in new forces to prevent collapse and buy time for the stabilization of defenses farther east. German planning during this stage emphasized the destruction of Soviet mechanized formations that had been repeatedly committed piecemeal. To achieve this, panzer divisions shifted their focus to set-piece engagements. Instead of bypassing strong points, they encircled and eliminated them methodically. Nonetheless, the sheer volume of Soviet reinforcements ensured that German divisions faced constant pressure and could not advance unopposed. Soviet command viewed Orsha as a vital barrier. Its loss would open the way to Smolensk and threaten Moscow. For this reason, Stavka insisted on holding the line regardless of the cost. The largest operations in this phase centered on a series of tank battles along the Moscow Highway and the Smolensk rail corridor. German panzer divisions advanced east of the Dnieper, only to encounter counterattacks by Soviet tank brigades deploying T-34s and KV-1s in massed assaults. These clashes often involved hundreds of tanks engaging over a single day. German Panzer III and Ivor units, though more maneuverable, struggled to penetrate Soviet armor without close-range fire or the support of 80mm guns. At the same time, Soviet formations lacked adequate coordination. Thousands attempted to flee eastward along the railways and highways, but many were caught in bombardments or overrun by advancing troops. Those who remained in Orsha faced starvation as supplies were exhausted. Water became scarce, and disease spread in crowded shelters. German bombardments destroyed hospitals, while Soviet authorities carried out scorched earth measures, demolishing bridges and warehouses to deny them to the enemy. Civilians often bore the brunt of these policies, left with no shelter or resources in the midst of battle. By the final days of July, the peak of combat around Orsha had left both armies drained. The Germans had secured partial control of key approaches and crossings, but the Soviets continued to resist fiercely in pockets. What had been intended by the Wehrmacht as a rapid capture had become a prolonged and costly struggle. The Red Army, though battered, had achieved its objective of delaying the German timetable. The Battle of Orsha at its height demonstrated the ferocity of the Eastern Front, Massive armored clashes, urban destruction, and human suffering on a scale few had anticipated only weeks earlier. After weeks of heavy fighting, the Soviet defense around Orsha shifted from large-scale armored counterattacks to measures of resistance and adaptation. The mechanized corps had been bled nearly dry, their tanks destroyed or abandoned, but Soviet commanders and soldiers continued to search for ways to delay the Wehrmacht. The Red Army, though devastated, learned quickly from its earlier failures and improvised defensive strategies, while civilians and remnants of units began forming the nucleus of future partisan movements in the surrounding forests. On the battlefield, adaptation took the form of new defensive tactics. Soviet infantry units, deprived of armor support, fortified every natural obstacle. Villages, riverbanks, and forest edges were turned into strongpoints. Anti-tank ditches and minefields were laid in depth, designed to channel German armor into kill zones. Infantry companies equipped with anti-tank rifles, Molotov cocktails, and captured German weapons were deployed in ambushes. Though often undertrained, they managed to disable panzers in close combat, forcing the Germans to commit more artillery and engineers to each assault. This transition marked a shift from offensive counterattacks to a more defensive, attritional posture, an early sign of how the Red Army would evolve during the war. Improvisation also extended to logistics. With supply lines overstretched and depots destroyed, Soviet troops scavenged abandoned German vehicles, weapons, and ammunition. Crews repaired disabled tanks with salvaged parts, returning a handful to service. Field workshops operated under constant threat of air raids, producing improvised armored cars and refitting artillery captured from the enemy. Soldiers relied on local resources, requisitioning food from civilians or hunting in the forests. Though these measures were insufficient to restore full strength, they allowed resistance to continue even when formal supply channels had collapsed. Psychologically, the toll of prolonged combat was immense. Soviet soldiers endured constant bombardment, shortages of food, and exhaustion. Yet morale was sustained by political officers and propaganda, which emphasized the defense of Moscow and the inevitability of German defeat. Orders from the Stavka declared Orsha a key defensive point that must not be abandoned. Deserters faced execution, and discipline was enforced with severity. At the same time, the resilience of ordinary soldiers was remarkable. Units cut off from higher command often fought on independently, refusing to surrender even when surrounded. These small acts of resistance slowed German advances, forcing them to allocate time and resources to clear bypassed positions. Civilian resistance began to emerge in this period as well. With Orsha and its surroundings devastated, many residents fled into the forests, where they provided support to Soviet stragglers. Food, shelter, and intelligence about German movements were shared, laying the groundwork for partisan warfare. Some civilians, embittered by German occupation practices and reprisals, joined organized partisan detachments. While still small in the summer of 1941, these groups would grow into a major factor in the region later in the war. German commanders quickly recognized the threat, responding with harsh anti-partisan measures that further alienated the local population. For the Wehrmacht, Soviet adaptation presented new challenges. Panzer divisions, designed for rapid exploitation, found themselves bogged down in clearing fortified villages and countering ambushes. Casualties mounted as infantry advanced through mined terrain and sniper fire. Tank crews reported increasing anxiety at the close-range tactics of Soviet infantry, which could disable even modern German vehicles with explosives or incendiaries. The attritional nature of the fighting was far from the decisive breakthrough envisioned by the planners of Barbarossa. Supply shortages and mechanical wear added to the strain as vehicles broke down after weeks of continuous operation. Despite their difficulties, the Germans pressed forward methodically. Engineers cleared mines, artillery pounded fortified points, and the Luftwaffe struck at concentrations of resistance, yet each advance cost time and equipment. Soviet resistance, though fragmented, achieved its purpose. It delayed the German timetable and forced the Wehrmacht into costly battles of attrition. Even as the Red Army was reduced to fragments in the Orsha sector, it succeeded in shaping the character of the conflict, demonstrating that even against superior firepower, adaptation and determination could deny the enemy easy victories. By the end of July, Orsha was firmly within the grip of battle, its defenses crumbling yet still defiant. Soviet forces had shifted from large-scale operations to localized resistance, adapting tactics and relying on resourcefulness. Though the city's fall was inevitable, the lessons learned in these desperate days, improvised defenses, partisan support, and the psychological resilience of troops, foreshadowed the broader Soviet strategy that would later turn the tide of the war. Orsha thus stood not only as a graveyard of tanks, but also as an early symbol of endurance, showing that even in near collapse, the Red Army could adapt and resist. By the beginning of August 1941, the Battle of Orsha reached a decisive turning point. After nearly 3 weeks of fighting, the balance shifted irreversibly in favor of the Wehrmacht. Soviet counterattacks, which had initially slowed the German advance, had exhausted themselves. Mechanized corps were virtually destroyed, rifle divisions were reduced to fragments, and ammunition stocks were almost depleted. The Germans, though bloodied and worn down, retained the initiative and the means to press forward. The struggle around Orsha, which had once held the promise of halting the advance on Smolensk, now turned into a desperate effort by the Red Army simply to delay collapse. The shift became evident in the collapse of Soviet armored strength. In the opening stages, the 5th and 7th Mechanized Corps had fielded hundreds of tanks, including the feared T-34s and KV-1s. By early August, fewer than 10% remained operational. Many were destroyed in combat, others abandoned for lack of fuel or spare parts. This synergy allowed the Wehrmacht to conserve armored strength for deeper thrusts toward Smolensk, while systematically breaking down Soviet defenses. The psychological dimension of the turning point was stark. Soviet troops, still fighting with determination, were increasingly aware that their situation was untenable. Exhaustion, hunger, and mounting casualties eroded morale. Desertions and surrenders grew more common, despite harsh disciplinary measures. Political officers continued to enforce Stalin's not-a-step-back orders, but their influence waned as soldiers confronted the reality of encirclement. German troops, though fatigued, sensed victory. Confidence returned as Soviet counterattacks dwindled and resistance appeared more fragmented. The destruction of Soviet tank units in particular restored the sense of technological superiority that had been shaken by the first encounters with T-34s. The city of Orsha itself reflected the turning point. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group moved to complete the encirclement of Soviet armies around Smolensk, one of the largest battles of the early campaign. Orsha, once envisioned as a defensive anchor, was reduced to a way station in the larger German advance. For the Soviets, the turning point carried profound consequences. The loss of Orsha eliminated a critical defensive line and exposed Smolensk to attack. It also revealed the shortcomings of Soviet doctrine and logistics. Mechanized corps had proven incapable of coordinated counteroffensives under German pressure. Communication breakdowns and inadequate supplies doomed even the most determined efforts. Yet the resistance at Orsha, though unsuccessful, bought crucial time. By delaying the Wehrmacht for weeks, it allowed the Soviet High Command to organize deeper defenses and mobilize additional armies near Moscow. The sacrifice of men and machines at Orsha thus contributed indirectly to the eventual slowing of the German offensive later in the year. In sum, the turning point of the Battle of Orsha marked the transition from contested struggle to German domination of the sector. The Red Army, exhausted and bled dry, could no longer hold the Dnieper line. German forces secured their objectives, cleared the armored graveyard, and prepared to advance. The battle's outcome highlighted both the ferocity of Soviet resistance and the brutal effectiveness of German operational methods in 1941. Orsha had been fought over fiercely, but its fate was sealed once Soviet reserves were consumed. From this point forward, the struggle shifted toward Smolensk, and the Dnieper crossing at Orsha became one more step in the Wehrmacht's march eastward. The aftermath of the Battle of Orsha unfolded in the first weeks of August 1941, as German forces consolidated their hold on the city and surrounding areas while the shattered remnants of Soviet units attempted to withdraw eastward. The fighting had left the region devastated, with enormous human and material losses on both sides, but it was the Red Army and the civilian population who bore the heaviest consequences. The fall of Orsha marked the end of organized resistance in this sector of the Dnieper line and opened the road toward Smolensk, yet the price was destruction on a scale visible across every battlefield. For the Soviet forces, withdrawal was chaotic and often impossible. Units that had once fielded thousands of men and hundreds of tanks were reduced to small groups, scattered through forests or retreating along secondary roads. Some tried to cross the Dnieper farther east, abandoning heavy equipment in order to escape German encirclements. Many others surrendered after running out of ammunition and supplies. German records list tens of thousands of prisoners captured in the Orsha area during late July and early August. These included officers, staff personnel, and entire companies that had been cut off. Prisoners were marched to improvised camps, where food and shelter were scarce and mortality was high. For the Soviets, the loss of manpower was compounded by the destruction of their mechanized corps, leaving them unable to mount large counterattacks in the central sector for weeks. German forces, though victorious, also faced the consequences of attrition. Panzer divisions reported significant reductions in their operational strength. Some units counted fewer than half their original tanks, still serviceable after weeks of combat. Infantry divisions were depleted from constant fighting in forests, villages, and streets. The Luftwaffe, heavily engaged in bombing missions against Soviet reinforcements, suffered losses to flak and mechanical strain. Despite these difficulties, the Wehrmacht moved quickly to restore order. Engineers repaired damaged bridges and railway lines, bringing supplies forward. Orsha's rail junction, though heavily damaged by bombardment and demolition, was gradually restored to function as a logistical base for the drive on Smolensk. The city of Orsha itself lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been destroyed by artillery fire and air raids. Rail yards and factories were gutted, warehouses burned, and housing stock severely reduced. Civilians who had not fled during the fighting now faced occupation. German authorities requisitioned food, clothing, and shelter for their troops. Civilians were compelled to clear rubble, bury bodies, and repair damaged roads. For many, survival depended on scavenging or trading with soldiers. The humanitarian crisis was acute. Hunger, disease, and exposure took a heavy toll. Reports from survivors describe corpses lying unburied in streets, animals feeding on wreckage, and families displaced from their homes. The occupation brought further hardship, as reprisals against suspected resistance began almost immediately. Soviet attempts to maintain resistance after Orsha's fall were limited but persistent. Stragglers regrouped in forests east of the city, linking with local civilians to form the earliest partisan bands. These groups launched raids on German patrols, sabotaged rail lines, and ambushed convoys. Though small and poorly equipped, they forced the Wehrmacht to allocate forces to security operations. German commanders, alarmed by partisan activity, responded with harsh measures, burning villages suspected of aiding resistance, executing hostages, and tightening control of movement. Soviet propaganda reframed the defeat as a heroic stand, highlighting the sacrifice of soldiers and civilians who resisted against overwhelming odds. German propaganda, by contrast, emphasized the destruction of Soviet armor and the capture of vast numbers of prisoners. Both narratives reflected the political importance of the battle. For the Germans, proof of Barbarossa's progress. For the Soviets, evidence of resilience and sacrifice in the face of immense adversity. By mid-August, the battlefield around Orsha had grown quiet, but the devastation remained. Fields were strewn with wrecked tanks and vehicles, the skeletal remains of armored corpses that testified to the scale of destruction. The human cost was equally visible. burned villages, mass graves, and a city scarred by fire and bombardment. Withdrawal for the Soviets was not merely a movement of troops, but the loss of an entire defensive line, leaving a legacy of destruction that shaped both the local population's fate and the course of the campaign in central Russia. The Battle of Orsha in the summer of 1941 left a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate fighting. It was one of the first large-scale clashes on the Dnieper line and one of the bloodiest armored battles of the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa. Though overshadowed by the encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, and later Kiev, Orsha became remembered as an armored graveyard where the promise of swift German victory was challenged by determined Soviet resistance, and where thousands of tanks and soldiers were lost in a struggle that shaped the tempo of the campaign. For the Wehrmacht, the battle was ultimately a success. Orsha was captured, its rail junction secured, and the Dnieper line breached. The destruction of Soviet mechanized corps in this sector removed a significant obstacle to the advance on Smolensk, yet the cost was higher than expected. Panzer divisions lost hundreds of vehicles, infantry divisions endured heavy casualties, and the Luftwaffe committed extensive resources to suppress Soviet resistance. The rapid, near-effortless victories of June gave way at Orsha to slower, more attritional combat. German commanders recognized that the Red Army, though battered, was far from destroyed, and that the campaign might not conclude within the short time frame envisioned by Hitler. Orsha thus contributed to the gradual slowing of Operation Barbarossa, even as the Wehrmacht continued to advance. For the Red Army, Orsha was both a disaster and a lesson. The destruction of the 5th and 7th Mechanized Corps and the collapse of the Dnieper Line marked a severe defeat, with tens of thousands of men lost and hundreds of tanks destroyed. Yet the battle also demonstrated that Soviet forces could resist, delay, and inflict meaningful losses on the invader. Encounters between T-34s and KV-1s and German panzers shocked the Wehrmacht and revealed the potential of Soviet armor. Although mismanaged and squandered in poorly coordinated counterattacks, these tanks proved technically superior to most German models, foreshadowing the challenges the Wehrmacht would face later in the war. The adaptation of Soviet infantry tactics at Orsha, ambushes, fortified villages, and close-range anti-tank measures, also previewed the evolution of Red Army doctrine that would mature in subsequent battles. For civilians, Orsha's legacy was one of suffering and devastation. The city itself was nearly destroyed, its infrastructure in ruins. Thousands of civilians were killed in bombardments, while survivors endured hunger, disease, and occupation. German policies of requisition, forced labor, and reprisals against suspected partisans created an atmosphere of terror. At the same time, the battle marked the beginning of organized civilian resistance in the region. Partisan groups, supported by local populations, grew in the aftermath, laying the foundation for a long war of attrition behind German lines. The civilian memory of Orsha remained defined by both the trauma of destruction and the pride of resistance. Politically and culturally, Orsha became part of the Soviet narrative of the Great Patriotic War. Though the city was lost in 1941, official accounts framed the battle as an example of heroism and sacrifice, emphasizing the determination of soldiers and workers to resist at all costs. Monuments were erected after the war, commemorating the defenders and victims. In Soviet historiography, Orsha was often overshadowed by larger battles, but still recognized as a significant episode in the struggle to halt the German advance. German accounts, by contrast, portrayed the battle as a demonstration of Wehrmacht superiority, while acknowledging the unexpected toughness of Soviet resistance. For historians today, Orsha stands as evidence of the costly attritional nature of Barbarossa and the flaws in both German and Soviet planning. The long-term significance of Orsha lies in its role as a harbinger of the larger struggle to come. It showed that the German invasion, while devastating, would not bring the rapid collapse of the Soviet Union. It revealed that Soviet forces, despite catastrophic losses, could regroup and fight with resilience. And it exposed the weaknesses in both armies: German overconfidence in rapid victory, Soviet reliance on underprepared mechanized corps, and the immense human cost of total war. Orsha's fields of wrecked tanks and burned villages symbolize the Eastern Front's character, massive in scale, merciless in intensity, and destructive for both sides. In the decades that followed, Orsha's memory remained tied to its identity as a battlefield of sacrifice. For the people of Belarus, it was a reminder of the suffering endured under occupation and the destruction wrought on their land. For the Soviet Union, it was one more chapter in the narrative of resistance that culminated in victory in 1945. Today, the legacy of Orsha continues to illustrate the cost of war. A city reduced to rubble, armies bled dry, and civilians caught in the crossfire of ideologies. It endures as a symbol of the armored graveyard of 1941, a place where both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army learned that the road to Moscow would be far more costly than either side had imagined.